Welcome back to Past and Present, where we revisit the timeless treasures of pop culture that shaped generations. Today we're diving into something that hooked us for hours, tested our patience, and created unforgettable memories. Classic retro games. The video is titled Unforgettable Retro Games. The classics we couldn't put down. And as you'll quickly see, these weren't just games, they were cultural milestones, they were rituals, and they became part of who we were. Let's set the stage. Imagine walking into an arcade in the late 70s or 80s. The air is buzzing with electronic beeps and music, coins clinking in pockets, neon lights glowing, and the constant chatter of kids and teenagers lined up for their turn. Or maybe, for some of you, the memory is curled up on the living room floor, sitting just a few feet away from a chunky television, holding a rectangular controller that left imprints on your hands. Wherever you were, retro games had one thing in common. They had an almost magical ability to keep us playing over and over again. So what made them so addictive? Was it the simple mechanics, the competitive spirit, the feeling of mastery as you pushed just a little further each time? It was all of those things, and more. Today, we're going to take a nostalgic journey through some of the most unforgettable games from the past that we simply couldn't put down. Let's begin with a cornerstone of arcade culture, Pac-Man. Released in 1980, this game was deceptively simple, just a little yellow character gobbling dots while avoiding 4 colourful ghosts. But the genius was in the design. It was easy to understand yet hard to master. The more you played, the more you developed strategies, memorized ghost patterns, and chased high scores. Pac-Man also became a cultural icon, spawning merchandise, cartoons, and even a hit song. But at the core, it was addictive because it combined short, fast-paced rounds with that just one more try feeling that kept players feeding quarters into the machine. Another arcade giant we couldn't put down was Space Invaders. Released in 1978, it was one of the first games to truly capture the sense of tension and progression. The aliens descended slowly at first, but with each one you shot, the pace increased until your heart was pounding. The sound effects sped up along with the action, creating this sense of dread and excitement. People lined up to play, and in Japan it even caused a shortage of 100 yen coins. That's how powerful the pull of this game was. Of course, we can't talk about addictive retro games without mentioning Tetris. Originally developed in the Soviet Union in 1984, Tetris quickly became a global phenomenon. Those falling blocks, known as tetraminos, seemed harmless at first, but the speed picked up relentlessly, testing your reflexes and spatial awareness. The beauty of Tetris was in its simplicity. Anyone could pick it up in seconds, but it also had infinite replay value. And let's not forget the famous Tetris effect. Players would close their eyes and still see falling blocks. That's when you know a game has truly taken over your brain. Moving from puzzle games to platformers, we enter the world of Super Mario Bros. Released in 1985 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This game revolutionized home gaming. It wasn't just about running and jumping, it was about exploring worlds, discovering secrets, and overcoming carefully designed challenges. The music, the controls, the bright visuals, all combined to create a game that felt endlessly replayable. Kids would spend entire weekends trying to reach new levels or mastering tricky jumps. Mario wasn't just a character, he was a companion, a hero we rooted for every time we picked up the controller. But Mario didn't dominate the scene alone. Sonic the Hedgehog blasted his way into our hearts in 1991. Where Mario was methodical and precise, Sonic was about speed and adrenaline. The loops, springs, and fast-paced gameplay made it impossible not to get hooked. You wanted to see how fast you could go, how many rings you could collect, and whether you could survive the dreaded underwater levels. The rivalry between Mario and Sonic even defined the early console wars, and many of us found ourselves completely loyal to one side, or secretly playing both. Now let's talk about one of the most famously addictive fighting games, Street Fighter II. Released in 1991, it changed the arcade forever. The variety of characters, each with their own unique moves, created endless possibilities for strategy and competition. Players would crowd around machines, waiting their turn to challenge the reigning champ. Winning wasn't just about fun, it was about status, and the mastery required to pull off special moves like Ryu's Hadouken or Chun-Li's lightning kicks kept players coming back again and again. Speaking of competition, another game that defined multiplayer fun was GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64. Released in 1997, it brought first-person shooters into the living room. For many of us, this was the ultimate sleepover game. 4 friends, 1 screen, countless hours of sneaking around, blasting each other and arguing about who got to play as odd job. GoldenEye was addictive not just because of the gameplay, but because it turned gaming into a social event, something you shared, argued about, and laughed over for hours. We can't ignore the impact of Pokémon either. Pokémon Red and Blue, released in the late 90s, weren't just games, they were obsessions. Catching them all wasn't just a slogan, it was a mission. The addictive loop of exploring, battling, and collecting made these games almost impossible to put down. Add in the ability to trade with friends and suddenly the game spilled out into the playground and beyond. Pokémon became a lifestyle, and it all started with those pixelated adventures on the Game Boy. Let's take a step back to one of the most iconic puzzle platformers ever made. Donkey Kong. Released in 1981, it was where Mario actually made his debut as Jumpman. The simple act of climbing ladders, dodging barrels, and trying to rescue the damsel in distress was far harder than it looked. Donkey Kong set the standard for challenging yet rewarding gameplay, and it laid the foundation for countless games that followed. And then there's The Legend of Zelda, released in 1986. Unlike most games of the era, Zelda wasn't about quick rounds or high scores. It was about exploration, adventure, and discovery. The open-world design was revolutionary, giving players the freedom to choose their own path. The game was addictive not in the traditional sense, but because it created a world you wanted to live in. Hours could vanish as you uncovered secrets, solved puzzles, and defeated enemies. Zelda showed that games could be more than entertainment. They could be journeys. For sports fans, few games were as unforgettable as NBA Jam. Released in the arcades in 1993, it was outrageous, over-the-top basketball fun. Players performed impossible dunks, shouted catchphrases like, "He's on fire," and competed in fast-paced matches that kept the adrenaline pumping. It wasn't realistic, but that was the point. It was fun, chaotic, and endlessly replayable with friends. We also have to mention Pong, the game that arguably started it all. Released in 1972, Pong was incredibly basic, 2 paddles and a ball, but for those who experienced it at the time, it was revolutionary. The competitive nature of Pong made it addictive. It was simple enough that anyone could play, but you always wanted to beat your opponent to get just 1 more point. Pong proved that video games could capture attention and spark competition, and it paved the way for everything else on this list. Of course, part of what made these games unforgettable was the way they became tied to memories. For many, it wasn't just about the high scores or the levels conquered, it was about who you played with. It was about bonding with siblings, competing with friends, or even playing against strangers at the arcade. These games became shared experiences that shaped childhoods and friendships. Even today, decades later, many of these titles remain popular. They're re-released on modern consoles, played on emulators, or revisited in arcades that still keep the old machines alive. And that tells you something. They weren't just addictive in the moment, they have a timeless quality that keeps us coming back. So why couldn't we put these games down? Because they were perfectly balanced between simplicity and challenge. Because they offered us worlds of imagination. Because they connected us to other people. And because they made us feel something powerful: excitement, frustration, triumph, and joy. As we look back on these unforgettable classics, we realize that they weren't just games, they were chapters of our lives. And whether you were a Pac-Man pro, a Pokémon trainer, a GoldenEye sharpshooter, or a Tetris master, you carried those moments with you. So here's the question for you. Which retro game did you find impossible to put down? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss more nostalgic journeys with past and present. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep playing and keep remembering the classics that made us who we are.